Welcome into the Invest Well Show. I'm your host, Michael Wall. Listen, we got a really fun show today. I'm with a special guest, Eric Wynn, not only a good friend, great guy, good family man, but he has been in the luxury watch space for years and years and years. Now, if you say it correctly, it's timepieces. Okay, so let's just say it right. So however you want to say it, Eric, I don't know, but Wynn Vintage, that's where you live.com. You guys have really done a great job as far as integrating yourself in this space. And one of the things that I didn't realize until we connected, that the watch space, luxury watches, I mean, it's literally billions and billions of dollars a year. So first off, thanks for taking a minute to share some thoughts with the listeners.
Thank you for having me, Michael. Yeah, it's a massive space. Just exports out of Switzerland at wholesale value are over 50 billion per year.
Wow.
So you're talking about retail value, 80 billion plus US dollars. It's estimated there's $1 trillion of luxury watches in the world.
Wow. Currently in circulation?
Yeah, in circulation. Some people know what they have. Some people have things hidden away in their drawers they don't realize are very valuable. And it's a fun treasure hunt.
That's cool. How did you get into this space? Like, what was like, man, what caused you to get into it?
Started with a watch from Pennsylvania, Hamilton, which was kind of the American-made watch back in the 1940s. My grandmother gave it to my grandfather for their wedding in 1947. After they passed, I inherited it, and I became very interested in vintage watches as a result. Hamilton, unfortunately, moved to Switzerland in the 1960s.
Okay.
They were purchased.
So they were producing them in the States.
Yes, yeah, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania.
Oh, yeah. Just where the U.S. Open was.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And their old factory is now an apartment building. But that was really, it's kind of a tale of American manufacturing. That's another story, I think.
In itself, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So something that's really interesting, and a lot of people, I certainly did not understand this, but there's, and we have some watches in front of us here that we'll talk about in just a minute. But if you're watching this, obviously via video, whether it's Spotify or iTunes or YouTube or whatever, if you're listening via iTunes, you want to make sure you check the video out on Spotify or wherever. But vintage versus modern. Let's talk about that. So, this is something, and by the way, I wanted to bring you in, not just to talk about, hey, let's showcase some watches, but I wanted to talk about the idea of the significant opportunity that can come. Obviously, there's big risk too. We'll talk about that in a minute. But to actually investing in something that is kind of a rare commodity in a lot of ways. And that's like anything else in life. That's one of the reasons, by the way, I wanted to do this show. Not just I met Eric, great guy, we've become friends, and he does this really cool space of watches, but we want to be intentional about thinking about what some outliers may be of where we can take advantage of some opportunity. And I think this might be one of those things as the economy moves and shifts along the way. But vintage versus modern, a lot of people don't think about it that way. They think, hey, I'm going to buy a Rolex, and it's just, this is what I'm looking for. But talk us through a little bit about the difference there.
Yeah, so vintage is really where I started with my grandfather's own watch and kind of my passion. Typically, those are kind of watches from the 1980s and older. Rolex is the majority of my business. They just are arguably the most well-known luxury company in the world. They're actually a nonprofit, which is very interesting. They give away a huge amount of money every year.
So Rolex is a nonprofit?
Yeah, based in Switzerland. They pay zero tax in Switzerland. They're very philanthropic. The founder, Hans Wilsdorf, didn't have any heirs, which is why he set it up as a sort of a foundation and nonprofit for when he passed away in 1959, 1960. But he was an orphan himself, so he donates to all kinds of orphanages around the world, all kinds of environmental research and things. Very interesting. So it's a great company. They make a great product, kind of the first water-resistant watch, which was a huge deal for if you're swimming or in all kinds of different environments. And that's the Oyster name comes from that. It's on most Rolex watches sold today.
So vintage, just for clarity, 1980.
1980s and older.
And older,
typically.
okay.
The term comes from wine, and it referred, vint is 20, basically it refers to in French. So it's really something 20 years and older. But we kind of call 1990s through early 2000 watches neo-vintage.
Okay.
And vintage itself is more 80s and older. One of the things is with like a vintage watch like this Paul Newman Daytona, this is worth about $400,000, but it's got an acrylic crystal. So it's plastic. It's got a dome. for a new watch, like this one's from 1997, it has a flat sapphire crystal, which is more scratch resistant and thinner. But I kind of like the charm of these older watches with water resist, with basically domed crystals.
So the Paul Newman $400,000 watch, what makes that so uniquely different other than the age?
It's funny because it really is just the dial. This is the exact same reference, same movement, same case. And this watch is $59,000, but this is about $400,000 because the dial, which is also people call the face, is very beautiful with a white and black registers. And Paul Newman himself wore one of these that was given to him by his wife, Joanne Woodward, when he was filming this movie Winning in 1969.
Yep.
His own watch sold in 2017 for $17.6 million at auction.
Wow.
The most expensive vintage wristwatch ever sold.
So we go vintage, and then would you call it neo
vintage,
vintage, and then
1990s.
modern?
Yeah, exactly.
Is that kind of the three?
Yeah, exactly.
Tranches, if you will.
Perfect.
So when you talk about modern, identify that. What does that look like?
That's really watches from the last 20 years, but for most people, it really refers to watches the last 5 to 10 years.
Okay.
And it's a huge business. Obviously, it's where most people are focused.
In the modern.
Yeah, because Rolex, for instance, produces roughly 1.3 million watches per year, but the wait lists for a new Daytona, it's impossible to even get on a wait list. People joke it's a 50-year wait list.
Really?
Can't really get on the list.
Wow.
It's kind of like Green Bay Packers season
right.
tickets. From Wisconsin, it's like 80-year plus wait list.
Yeah.
But
you got to know somebody.
Yeah, you just
got to know a guy.
You have to marry someone for the tickets at that point. But yeah, so that's a huge part of the business. It's a huge part of what I do because there's so much more demand for new watches. It's a huge industry, obviously the marketing that goes behind it and everything else. But we've seen a lot of values shift the last 2 years. Some of the watches that were trading at 5x the retail price when you walked out the door are now trading at maybe 1.5x. So they've come down significantly.
Wow.
Some people have lost millions of dollars things at too high of a price.
And we talked about that earlier. Is like they don't always go up, right?
Correct.
So since watches don't always go up, like how do you avoid overpaying? Like how does that? You look at something, you're out there. The consumer, the novice, is going to look at something. You see these what are they called, the super clones and all this stuff today.
Yeah.
It's like most novices are not going to be able to notice the difference.
Correct.
So to be in a place where you really get it examined, what are a couple metrics that people need to be looking at, maybe, Eric, other than going directly to winvintage.com, which is step one?
Yeah, exactly.
But realistically, what does that look like? Don't overpay. How do they avoid that?
I think one thing to consider is if the watch is still in production, because if you're buying something that's still being made, you have no control over the supply.
Kind of like the dollar.
Yeah, exactly. Very similar. There's no control, and a lot of the watch companies, Rolex is more limited on supply because they're not as profit driven, if you will.
Yep.
But some of the smaller brands are just producing like crazy, and I believe their production has increased 2 to 3x in 2 to 3 years because demand's so high.
Wow.
But they're just flooding the market and people don't realize.
So take a look at the watch that you're looking to buy and determine what the production current level is.
Yeah, if you can. If it's discontinued, it's a little bit safer because they're not making more of them, but they might be making something very similar that people view as more desirable. Obviously, my passion is vintage. They're really not making many of these. They've maybe made 2,000 or 3,000 total.
Of the Paul Newmans.
Yeah, and that was only maybe half of those survive, and most are in not great condition. So when you get into the older watches, it's really about the condition, kind of like collecting vintage baseball cards.
Yeah.
And you have a grading system with vintage baseball cards and things like that, which we don't have with watches. So you really have to understand what you're buying, buy it from a legitimate place, and really kind of learn about what you're doing.
We talked before, Eric, about you being in a place where you might have the opportunity to participate in, we'll call it valuation.
Yeah.
Of watches and what that looks like, because you're pretty sought out after. I mean, you've done a lot of stuff with Rolex directly.
Not Rolex so much, but definitely Christie's.
Christie's. Okay, there you go. That's
and all kinds of other companies. Yeah.
Okay.
I consult for a few auctions.
So okay, that's what I was thinking more or less, and I apologize for that. But when you take a look at valuation, is there something that can be done in this industry that you can say, hey, here's a guide other than production of kind of valuation to get it real?
It's very hard. There's no scale. There's no like you can't send it in for a grade. But I have kind of I gave a few lectures on this to the Horological Society of New York that are on YouTube. You need to understand the dial condition. Even the paint that glows in the dark on these old watches is often replaced, and that could mean hundreds of thousands of dollars of loss in value. As a result, there are many people that try to deceive. They'll relume, but do it with vintage lume, as we say, repaint the dials. There's all kinds of shenanigans, I would say, and funny business. You really have to be careful. Unfortunately, I've met people that have lost hundreds of thousands of dollars buying fake or undisclosed problematic vintage watches.
And you're in a place where you're dealing with people as they come to you all over the map. You got people that are first time, I want a Rolex or I want whatever, and then all the way to people that have, probably lots of watches, right? So what do you find is the big difference between both? Is the collector with millions, or they're just all about collecting, they care about the growth and value, or they're just jazzed about the watch in general? What do you see there?
I think the people that generally spend a lot are very savvy. So it's nice because you can have a very brief conversation with someone and they understand exactly what you're saying. It's on the same page. If I sometimes joke, you don't want to sell someone their first vintage watch because it's a very difficult process for them to understand what they're buying.
They're not going to see the value.
Yeah, and the way they treat it even, like these are acrylic crystals, so if you bang it, it can crack, whereas sapphire doesn't. Some people swim with their vintage watches, and they might not be water resistant. We try to make everything water resistant. They can get flooded. When I was at Christie's, Christie's just kind of sells everything as is, and a lot of dealers do that as well. They don't go to any effort to try to make them water resistant or replace the rubber gaskets inside or anything like that. We sold a Submariner and a guy went diving with it. It was from the 1970s. The watch was flooded and completely destroyed, but it was not, sold as a water resistant watch. It was just sold as a watch.
Yeah.
So that's, there's a lot of ways that things can go wrong.
Yeah. Paying attention on the journey.
Yes.
So the idea here is if you're looking at this space, right, the vintage watch or even, modern or neo vintage space, you want to be in a place where you say, okay, like anything else, it's sections of what you're doing. We're not giving you advice to do or not to do, but it's just a thought. It's an idea. And when you take a look at things, you might say, I love some of what Eric's talking about. And so I want to maybe have some things in my a lot of people collect cars.
Yes.
Right? They'll collect cars or they'll collect other types of things. Yeah, artwork.
Wine. A friend who collects whiskey.
Yeah, exactly. So there's so many different things that you can collect, and this is just something that might be a different variance that who knows? Maybe you're like, I'm going to put $1 million or $2 million or $3 million into, vintage style watches, and I need some guidance and help along the way of someone that knows this space. That's one of the reasons I wanted to bring Eric in. And so now you're saying, I want to do that because I'm investing into something that could, gain value, could lose value, but we know that it's kind of exclusive and rare.
Yeah. One other positive that we haven't touched upon, they're very small, they're very portable, and
that's true.
They're pretty easy to insure. You can have them in a safe deposit box, you can have them in a safe, you can do all kinds of different things with them that you can't with like a vintage car. And the cost of upkeep's much higher on cars.
That's a great point.
These, if they're kept well, like you really don't need to service them for many years. And when you do, it's $1,000, whereas servicing a vintage Ferrari can literally be $50,000 to $100,000.
So as an alternative investment idea, you're in a situation where your cost for maintenance is much less.
Much lower, and it's
easy to transport.
The insurance is way lower. Everything's much easier.
Yeah. That's good to know. Last question I want to ask you, Eric, and this has been enlightening in a lot of ways, but when you look at the market right now, and you look at trends, I know you're posting about a new watch every 3 seconds on Instagram. But realistically, actually it's 5 seconds.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But what would you say is hot right now? I know that all has, beauty is in the eye of the beholder kind of thing, but from your perspective globally, because there's going to be people from all over the world that listen to this, but from a global perspective, what is hot right now?
So Rolex is always, it's kind of like if Fortune 500. It just ticks along. It's just the most well-known. Everything else, it's probably a good place to keep a lot of your collection. You can get into the more exotic and esoteric models as well. Vintage Cartier has been extremely hot. That's more of a jewelry oriented watch, typically gold with a white dial. Many of those watches have gone up 5x in a 2 to 3 year span, which I never quite thought I would see. Otherwise I would have bought a lot more of them. But you know, certain things like this, these are from the 1990s.
And what is this that you're holding
This is
now?
a Patek Philippe perpetual calendar.
Mm-hmm.
This watch cost about $100,000 in 1999. We're selling it today for $72,000.
Wow.
But I believe this watch will be north of $100,000 again. You know, it's a
beautiful watch.
Yeah, it's fantastic. It's kind of the ultimate dress watch. This watch accounts for the leap year every 4 years, so that's why it's incredibly complicated, but still very thin. And you know, whenever you don't need to reset it on February 29th.
So it accounts for the leap year every 4 years.
And it took decades for Patek Philippe to figure out how to basically fit that complication in a case this small.
Yeah.
It was a marvel of engineering. So something like this is great. Universal Genève was a defunct watch brand, but Breitling recently purchased them for $69 million from a businessman in Hong Kong, and they're investing a lot of money in restarting the company. So as a result, all these watches that were kind of languishing on the secondary market, vintage Universal Genève has absolutely skyrocketed. Everyone wants them.
Picking up steam.
And particularly as the company approaches a relaunch, I'm part of the advisory group to the company. But as that launch comes, there'll be many more people aware of that company than there were, a year ago.
Yeah, that's awesome. And how challenging is it you have a watch, it's appreciated. How hard is it really to sell it? What's that marketplace look like?
It's way easier to sell. Obviously, I buy and sell myself. You can sell through auction houses. There's online platforms. You can list it yourself on different platforms. eBay, Chrono24 is a big platform, etc. You have to be careful because there's always a lot of scams and everything else for a seller to deal with. But there's a lot more available avenues that kind of make the market have less friction than in the past.
So the digital marketplace has opened up a lot of flexibility there.
And even you can take a photo and put it on Instagram and say you're selling it. And people do that all the time. There's Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups. Like it's incredible.
That's wonderful. Well, thanks for taking some time to share your expertise.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
Absolutely. Listen, again, very important information when you're taking a look at alternative asset classes, I'm going to call it. I think one of the things that you got to be thinking about when you look at investment, you look at opportunity, where are things going and what has sustainable tethers that is always going to have some level of demand? One of the things that Eric mentioned is about the idea of the portability of something like this. I think that's huge. If you have a beautiful beach property somewhere, as an example, that's in a place that may have hurricanes or things, you're going to have massive upkeep, massive cost to maintain that. So I think when we take a look at where things are, you've heard me say it before in relation to the investment space, a great idea is to understand that money doesn't go away, it just moves. We want to be paying attention to where money is moving. And I think that's one of the reasons that when you look at this space in particular, you got to get some help. You got to get some guidance. And I wanted to have Eric on because he's just that. He's a great coach and guide along the way. Now, he's not going to do it indefinitely, but if you're in a place where you're serious about this space, I would challenge you to reach out to him. Head over to winvintage.com and look at some of the stuff that he's got shaking, because I think looking at other things as we have market turmoil and challenge along the way is going to provide you just a different lens as far as your investment stack that I think a lot of other people along the way are taking. Listen, be blessed. Share this show with someone that needs to hear it, that might be intrigued by it. Have a good one, and we'll talk to you soon. See ya.